Hi everyone, welcome to the series of presentations on the articulations of the human body. In this series of 4 videos, we're going to examine different types of joints that are found throughout the body and to gain a better understanding of how these joints are involved in human movement. In the first presentation, we're going to look at the basics of joints and the articulations throughout the body, look at the different ways that they are classified. Some of the joints we're going to see are freely movable, such as the knee and the elbow. Others are semi-movable or not movable at all, even though 2 bones are joined together. And we'll look at these different joint classifications. In the second presentation, we'll take a look at a typical synovial joint. The synovial joints are the movable joints of the body. We'll talk about the structures that are found in synovial joints, the general arrangement of the bones, some of the other characteristics of synovial joints in general that are shared by all of the major joints of the body. In the third presentation, we will look at the different types of synovial joints. There are 6 different classifications of synovial joints. It's important to know these differences so that when we're thinking about the knee, which is a hinge joint, we have a better understanding of why it's a hinge joint, why it only moves in one plane, etc., versus a shoulder joint, which is a joint that moves in 3 planes, much more complex in terms of the movement that's available. So in the third presentation, we'll look at these different classifications of synovial joints and the movements that are allowed. In the final presentation, we'll kind of bring it all together and look at 2 examples of synovial joints. So we'll look at the knee and we'll look at the shoulder or the glenohumeral joint. And we'll talk about not just the bones and how they're connected, but we'll look at the connective tissue structures, cartilage structures, muscles, etc., and talk a little bit about how they all work together to create a stable but yet movable joint that lets us do really amazing things. So let's get started. In this presentation, I hope to go over a number of factors related to the study of joints and the articulations that are formed between bones throughout the body. We're going to quickly go over fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and bony joints, but we will spend the most of our time going over synovial joints, which are also known as diarthrodial joints, and they're the movable joints that are found throughout the body, such as the elbow, the interphalangeal joint, etc. Then kind of and we'll talk about the structures that are found in these synovial joints, but then kind of as a review or kind of a preview, I guess, of the future presentations, I'll real quickly take a look at a couple of the joints in the body to highlight how these synovial joints are structured. Well, first off, arthrology is the study of Arthrology is the study of joints. And that's what we're going to be here today. We're going to be arthrologists, which is exciting. And again, a lot of this you've been probably presented before, but I wanted to review it because it's really important that we understand the different joints in the body and their basic structure. In the majority of this class, the final kind of, well, I should say, I guess the middle, like 2/3, we're going to go region by region and look in depth at each of the major articulations in the body. But we need to look at the kind of the general structure of these articulations. And I think the better we understand how these bones are joined, what structures join these bones, and then how they move because of these the bony anatomy and the soft tissues around the joint, we're going to be better as professionals. We watch TV. I'm watching ESPN. I'm an athletic trainer. Often, because I understand how joints are structured and how they're supposed to move, and I'm sure you do this as well, you see this big hit in football or the way someone lands in basketball, and you're already pretty confident you know what's wrong with them if they're hurt because you understand that anatomy. So the better we understand the anatomy, I think the better professionals we can be. And that's with really all the topics we're going to cover in this class. But I think, again, the better we know the anatomy of these joints and the structures around the joints, the better we're going to be at prescribing exercise, which really is the goal of this class and this program as a whole. So if you read in our book or in other anatomy books and textbooks, joints can be classified in 2 different ways. They can be classified by basically the amount of movement that they provide. They also can be classified by the way that they're joined, or what structures join these bones together. So if we look at joints classified by their freedom of movement, we see such as diarthroses, which are freely movable, amphiarthroses, which are slightly movable, and synarthroses, which are joints where two bones are joined together where there's little or no movement. The joints we're most interested in, obviously, are the diarthroses, which are going to be our synovial joints. And another way that we'll classify these joints is by the way they're joined, which, again, is this bottom list. Fibrous joints, where we have some type of fibrous connective tissue that's forming a union, direct union between the bones. Cartilaginous joints, where it's cartilage between the bones. Bony joints, where we have two bones that have basically become ossified over time and basically cemented together by bone. And then finally, synovial joints. So the term diarthrosis and synovial joint can be used interchangeably. They're both these freely movable joints like the elbow, the knee, etc. So real quickly, let's just review fibrous, cartilaginous, and bony joints. We will not be taking real close look at these joints because they aren't as interesting to us. They aren't as commonly thought of by us because we deal with people and their movement. These joints do not move very much, but we do need to know where they are, and we do need to know their structure because they can be injured and they can affect synovial joints that may be near these, again, fibrous, cartilaginous, or bony joints. So fibrous joints are going to be two bones or more where there are collagen fibers spanning the space between the bones. So they're directly united by these collagen fibers. This includes suture joints, Gomphoses, and Syndesmosis. Cartilaginous joints are going to be joints where two bones are joined together by cartilage. Typically, these are going to have a little bit more motion than the fibrous joints, again, because cartilage itself is a fairly spongy tissue and therefore allows some motion. Often, cartilaginous joints are in places where we need some shock absorption, so the cartilage acts as a a piece of rubber that can absorb these forces and help absorb shock. The types of joints that have bones united by cartilage are called synchondroses or a symphysis joint. And then bony joints are going to be two bones that are directly fused by osseous tissue. And again, typically there's cartilage between these bones until they ossify, and they're called synostoses. And typically most of these unions fuse early in adulthood. So real quickly, suture joints are a fibrous joint. We find suture joints found in the skull between the large bones that form the skull, such as the frontal bone and the parietal bone, temporal bone, occipital bone. And these bones, again, first off, have a very wavy appearance and fit together like pieces of a puzzle. So the bony stability is very good to begin with, but then we directly unite these bones with fibrous tissue very closely together, so they pretty much function almost as a synostosis. They're very immovable. Very little movement between the bones of the skull. A gomphosis is a fibrous joint. The only place we find this is the union between a tooth and either the maxilla or the mandible, the upper jaw or the lower jaw. And again, it's where the tooth fits in a socket, and then basically the tooth is joined to the bone, again, through this fibrous tissue. This collagen and so on that holds the teeth in place. There is a slight amount of motion that occurs between the teeth and the mandible and maximal, and this is actually good, again, to help absorb shock, hopefully keep the teeth from breaking as often, and so on. A syndesmosis is a fibrous joint, and we see these in a couple places in the body, most notably between the ulna and the radius and the tibia and the fibula. And it's where two bones are bound by a ligament. In the case of the ulna and the radius here, we see this interosseous membrane. There also are some other ligaments that join the proximal and distal ends of these two bones. But this interosseous membrane unites the radius to the ulna. The cartilaginous joint is called a synchondrosis, and that's where two bones are joined directly by hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is kind of a thinner, not very dense type of a tissue, so directly unites the bones, but does not provide kind of that shock absorbing capability as the next joint we'll see. But it's basically where bones are joined together by hyaline cartilage, and eventually, typically, these types of synchondroses eventually ossify and become synchondroses. But not in all cases. One example would be the rib attachment to the sternum by this hyaline cartilage. So the ribs are attached to the sternum by this cartilage that's hyaline cartilage that is going to, again, kind of help form the rib cage. And then the joints at the ends of long bones that are present in children that are still growing, called the epiphyseal plate, which we talked about in the skeletal system lecture, that technically is a synchondrosis until it eventually ossifies. Another type of cartilaginous joint is a symphysis, and that's where two bones are joined by fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is different than hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is, kind of a looser type of a tissue, not as strong, not as dense, still somewhat elastic. Fibrocartilage has a much higher percentage of collagen fibers, so it has a much greater strength and tensile strength. In the case of these types of joints, symphysis joints, typically this fibrocartilage is fairly thick and allows for shock absorption. So it basically acts as a shock absorber between two bones. The pubic symphysis is an example of a symphysis. And then the joints between the vertebrae, or between the bodies of two vertebrae, where the intervertebral discs are, that's considered a symphysis as well. Again, great structure for absorbing force, as well as uniting two bones very substantially in a very strong way. There is some movement available, again, because the disc or the cartilage is somewhat elastic, but only a slight amount. Now you would say, okay, well, Tom, my back can move a lot, so there's a lot of motion. Well, it's because you have a little bit of motion between all of those different vertebrae, and that adds up to a fairly substantial amount of motion. So a Synostosis is a bony joint, and that's where two bones end up becoming fused by osseous tissue. This ossification occurs with age. An example is that the left and the mandible, your jawbone, is actually two separate bones that fuse around the time of birth into one solid jawbone. The left and right frontal bones, same thing, are actually split down the middle at birth and then ossify fairly early after birth. And then the epiphyses and the diaphyses of long bones, again, are filled with cartilage growth, hyaline cartilage. Once growth stops and adulthood is reached, or skeletal maturity is reached, the end of the bone and the shaft fuse together and become a synostosis.